Let's get to the focus of our lecture today, and that's Theodore Roosevelt, who really embodies the spirit of the progressive era. And I want to share with you first what historian Arthur Eckertz had to say about Roosevelt. He said, quote, "He had only the greatest scorn for the kind of middle-class individualism and liberalism," liberalism, of course, in the classical sense, not the Hillary Clinton sense, "that emphasized minding one's own business, both at home and abroad." And that indeed was the classical liberal tradition. Classical liberal, of course, means free trade, free markets, peace, civil liberties, the kind of tradition to which Thomas Jefferson belonged, and to which Frederick Bastiat and some of the great 19th century thinkers belonged. That's what Roosevelt is really a reaction against. H.L. Mencken, the great social critic, said all the fundamental objects of liberalism, and again we mean the classical variety, not the John Kerry, Obama sort of variety. All the fundamental objects of liberalism, free speech, unhampered enterprise, the least possible governmental interference, were abhorrent to him. And Mencken went on to say, in all his career, no one ever heard him make an argument for the rights of the citizen. His eloquence was always expended in expounding the duties of the citizen. Now, Theodore Roosevelt had, of course, quite a personality, unique in some ways among presidents. He was known for, as in later years, going on safaris and being a kind of a cowboy, a robust kind of man's man who willingly embraced the rigors of war, as he did during the Spanish-American War, who at times argued that peacetime, if it went on for too long, made individuals and nations grow flabby, that occasionally what was needed was a good war to encourage the martial virtues. Well, you can imagine how somebody with that type of personality, who wants to be at the center of everything, would grab hold of the presidential office and wring out of it everything he could, very much in line with the spirit of the progressive era. When Mark Twain had a chance to meet the president, he went away saying that this man is clearly insane. Roosevelt's own son said that father always wanted to be the bride at every wedding and the corpse at every funeral. Roosevelt at one point during the 1880s said that he was just exhausted, and so he just wanted to take a month off and do nothing but relax and write a biography of Oliver Cromwell. So he was an incredibly energetic person, and he brings this kind of energy, I might even say a kind of self-centeredness, to the execution of the duties of president. And he is going to expand the presidency. And in his autobiography/memoir that he publishes later, he recalls this with great pride, that I took the presidency and I made of it everything that there was to be made of it. And I built on precedents, and I expanded them, and I created new precedents. This isn't something that hostile scholars just make up. This is what he boasted of. He thought this was something, indeed, that the country needed. We could not cling to old-fashioned views of laissez-faire and modest presidents. We need big presidents with big visions and ideas and so on. So his philosophy of the presidency, you might say, ran as follows. Number one, the president is the unique representative of the American people, because the president is elected in an election that consists of all people in the country, whereas a U.S. senator is just voted for by people from that particular state. Nobody can lay claim to the kind of national mandate that a president can. And so the president is the unique representative of the American people. This was a new way of thinking. The president more or less may do whatever is not prohibited to him in the Constitution. It's not that he's got to limit himself to certain enumerated powers. He can more or less do whatever is not prohibited. And we also see Theodore Roosevelt kind of, we sometimes just refer to him by his initials, TR. We sometimes see him giving force to these ideas in his presidency through his use of what are known as executive orders. Executive orders are issued by the president with the intention of carrying out some function or ordering some government officials to do something. The point of them is that they are ways for the president to act on his own authority. Now, there are some ways in which executive orders can be entirely legitimate. There are ways in which they can be illegitimate, like if the president simply tries to pass a law by issuing an executive order and saying, now this is the law of the land, well, that would obviously be usurping the powers of Congress, because it is in the legislative branch where we see in the Constitution reposed the lawmaking power. So it would be an abuse of executive orders to use them for lawmaking purposes. However, it is legitimate to use, from a constitutional standpoint, executive orders to carry out clearly constitutional functions of government. So, for example, you could pardon people. The president has the power to pardon people, and you would carry that out by means of an executive order, things of that nature. But what's significant about Roosevelt is not just how he carried out his powers and how he used executive orders, but also the number of executive orders he issued. Because sometimes a quantitative measure, like the number of executive orders, can reveal a qualitative difference in the way somebody governs. So quantitative refers to the number of things. Qualitative refers to the kind. So because Theodore Roosevelt issues so many executive orders, this is an indication of the kind of presidency he envisions. So when we look at the decades leading up to Theodore Roosevelt's accession to the presidential office in 1901, we see presidents issuing maybe 3 executive orders, or 0, or Cleveland in one of his 2 non-consecutive terms issued 70 executive orders, and McKinley was around 50. And then Theodore Roosevelt issues over 1,000. So that is very much a reflection of his view that he is the unique representative of the American people. And if he has to climb over obstructionists like U.S. senators or anybody else that are going to stand in the way of carrying out the will of the people, then that's exactly what he's going to do. And a great example of this comes from, is an example of how Roosevelt did this and used executive orders, follows from his Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. So let's first explain what that is, and then we're going to see an example of him implementing that shows how he used executive orders as a way of being able to circumvent the U.S. Senate. So the Monroe Doctrine, you'll recall from 1823, made clear that the U.S. government would not tolerate intervention by European powers in the Americas. The Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine says if it looks like such intervention is impending, because, for example, one of these countries has engaged in wrongdoing or isn't paying its debts or whatever, and there's a prospect that there will be European intervention, the United States will intervene first to forestall the European intervention. So this is a much more robust and vigorous approach to U.S. policy in the Americas than the original Monroe Doctrine. Well, here's how this has to do with the discussion of executive orders. The Dominican Republic had been having exactly this problem of difficulty or refusal to pay its debts, and there were European powers growing impatient with it. So in 1905, early 1905, Roosevelt reached an agreement with the Dominican Republic allowing the U.S. government to supervise its customs house and treasury and try to work out some type of repayment so that we could forestall this sort of intervention by outside powers. Now this agreement, this treaty, was to go into effect about 10 days after it had been drafted. So obviously not enough time for the Senate to have time to deliberate and decide on it. So clearly Roosevelt had intended to just force this agreement through without any input from the Senate at all. But the resulting outcry forced him to, in fact, bring it before the Senate. And then the Senate, in a special session, adjourned without taking action on it. So Roosevelt simply carried it out anyway. He simply called it an executive agreement, which we might call like the foreign policy analog of an executive order. And he simply carried it out on his own authority. And you may ask, well, can he do that? Well, is he allowed to do that? Well, the point is he did do it. And as time went on, eventually the Senate, after the fact, endorsed what Roosevelt had done. But Roosevelt said later in his memoirs that it didn't matter that they later agreed to what I had done. I would have kept on through it all through the rest of my term. I've got to set precedents for a vigorous presidency. So this is very much opposed to what we might say was the old conservative view that the presidency has to be kept in check in particular. It's a particularly dangerous branch. If you have to favor a branch, you favor the legislative branch because it's the closest to the people. The House is elected every 2 years. But now we see this emphasis on growing executive power. And we see that in some of the examples of how Roosevelt conducted himself in office. For example, the United Mine Workers strike in 1902. TR had ordered mine owners to submit to arbitration in the strike, and should they remain obstinate, he threatened to order the Army to take over the coal mines and operate them. He summoned General John Schofield and said to him this: "I bid you pay no heed to any other authority, no heed to writ from a judge, or anything else excepting my commands." Schofield was to stand ready to seize the mines and run them for the government. Well, that's an example of the way Roosevelt exercised his powers while president.